Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. I have been both here and away for a couple of days, if not weeks, if you've been keeping up with the show. And this episode is a little bit of a warm-up for another one that is to follow. The topics will differ, but today we're going to talk about training and mindset, or training and how we think about how we approach something like training. It may immediately come across as a bit overly intellectual, but bear with me as we get into this kind of burgeoning topic, or this growing, it's not even growing, it's this continuously contentious topic about how or what you should be training for. See, this is a direct influence into gun culture, and, well, not talking about myself as an influence, but as rather a conversation that I have seen come up time and time again, year after year, about how we train for the scenarios that we are in, or we may find ourselves in. And it is oftentimes based or couched in the concept of need. Now, if we were to pull back away from just the topic of gun culture itself, and we're going to look at philosophy, especially Western philosophy, over the last, let's say a couple hundred of years, one of the challenges that the Enlightenment introduced, or finally concluded with when it came to both governance and politics, like the Second Amendment and so on and so forth, was how do we consider need when it comes to whether or not a person or peoples should do something. It might be as small as the actions of the individual, or as broad as the governance of a country. And the problem that what many of the Enlightenment philosophers came to, or maybe not even many, but you could draw from a collection, is that need itself is not sufficient for answering the questions before us. See, the question that we're going to be answering today is, what do you need to train for? Or more specifically, how do you measure what is supposed to be enough need? It again sounds very heady, but let's get into it. And yet, before we get started, I want to mention this episode's sponsor, the show's sponsor, which is Obsidian Arms. And now Obsidian Arms provides a number of things, services, gear, and equipment for those of us who are in the gun culture, whether it is parts and tools that make our maintenance and performance a little bit better, or services where you can turn your ideas into real life. See, they have a series of punch and tool kits that are going to be an advantage for anybody who has any desire for a level of self-sufficiency, but they also come with a lifetime warranty. So if you were to, say, buy a kit, damage a part or a tool, and then contact them, you can send it back and they'll send you a new one. Or if you want to take your hard-earned or hard-worked products into the real world, and you want to take your ideas and make them into something that you can add to the gun culture, you can get a hold of Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Have you ever heard somebody say something like, "You don't need to train for that"? This is kind of one of those odd things that gets said every once in a while, oftentimes by angry NCOs or the harsh judgments of other people on the internet, saying that you don't need to train for that scenario or that specific skill set. You don't need to learn how to do a sub-second reload because you're going to never be in a situation where you need to use more than one magazine, because you're only carrying one magazine on your person at any given time. Or you don't need to become comfortable with, maybe even confident with, hitting a 4-inch circle with your pistol or rifle at 20 feet, because you're never going to be in a hostage rescue situation. And it's this kind of odd mentality that comes up from time to time that uses need as a method of dismissing other training activities. You don't really need to learn how to ruck for 20 miles because you've got a 4x4 or whatever. And it's a really odd argument when you look at it in the grand scheme of what might happen in these kind of scenarios. See, if we were to take a group of men and try to train them for combat, we would want to focus on what are the most likely skills, what are the most likely scenarios that they're going to face. They're going to be much more likely to have to deal with perhaps a booby trap door or a potential explosive than they are going to have to deal with someone who's in a hostage rescue situation. This comes from positions of maybe special operations and different units and their skill sets, or from the skills of an individual. But the problem with this kind of mentality of approach to training is that it only really goes so far, and it leaves somebody frighteningly vulnerable to many, if not those specific scenarios. See, if you've been training for some time, you've been developing skill in some sort of activity or some sort of job set, let's call it carpentry, and you may never or very rarely have to frame a certain type of door or angle, yet that might work out for you for 90% of your career. And in some situations, again, let's use the example of carpentry, there are very rarely examples where if you're framing a house that you're going to be in some sort of life or death, all or nothing situation, because you're not as familiar with framing a certain piece or cutting a certain board. And that might be something that you can learn. However, the industry, it's not even the industry, the skill of use of force is a very different one. If you were to read a book by Lieutenant Colonel Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, Dave Grossman, geez, forgive me for that, and you read on his book on killing, you'll be able to pick up on how he talks about oftentimes very large scale scenarios are determined by the actions of a very few individuals. Or if you look at how the rise of special operations, whether it's through 3-letter agencies or just Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets, and so on and so forth, has grown in the last, let's say 50 years, you'll see how oftentimes a very few men have a greater influence on the outcome of a war than, at least by perception, the great many who are not there. And this can lead to egoistic problems where people in certain units think that they're above the norm. Caution advised. So what does this look like? If you were to imagine taking a skill set, we're going to talk about the easy punching bag of gun culture, and that is clearing a house or clearing a room, doing urban CQB or whatever the current phrase for it is now. There are many skill sets that you need to be able to use at different times, from breaching to pieing corners to clearing hallways to prepping bangers to the list grows on. But the strange mentality that comes up every once in a while is that you don't really need to train X action because you're never going to see it. This argument might land on solid ground when somebody is obsessed with something that is a very, very, very unlikely scenario, but perhaps catastrophic. However, what it tends to be, and how I tend to see the argument phrased, is that you don't really need to train something because it's unlikely to happen. The problem is, what will you do then when that is the exact scenario that you are faced with? See, it might be seen in a different light as if you don't need to train something, somebody is trying to eliminate superfluous activity, eliminate things that they don't need to do or are not exactly as beneficial as, say, something else. There are plenty of superfluous things that we can waste our time with becoming good at. If you're particularly a maritime active unit, or you are engaged, you live in the desert, being able to do perform some sort of action in an environment that you're not normally around might not want to be your focus. It's not exactly beneficial if you are operating in an arid desert with no water to be specifically good at underwater operations. But that argument kind of distills itself into almost madness when you look at situations like clearing a room. Now, sure, being able to perform a hostage rescue shot might not be something that you do multiple times in your life, but the one time that you have to do it is probably not going to want to be the time that you're doing it for the first time. Rephrasing that into better English, there are certain types of scenarios that we may encounter that are very uncommon, but when they do happen, have great consequence. You might transpose this into something not combat related at all, and that would be proposing to your girlfriend, or, you know, not even raising a child, but proposing to your girlfriend. You only really want to do it once in your life, but that may not be something that you want to be completely slack on. Now, it's an odd comparison, I know, but it's an odd comparison, I know, and it's not really something you practice for, like you practice a CQB movement or a battle drill or whatever, but it is something that you want to pay proper attention to. It's kind of like a wedding in that case. In an ideal world, an individual will only really have one wedding, one of those most important days of their life, which does lead to the mania that some people encounter, where they get so obsessed about this day that they're not really that they kind of start causing problems for it by their obsession. So you pull back a little bit and you realize, no, I need to enjoy this. I need to be able to invest in my marriage through my wedding and so on and so forth. And we're going to again make that switch into training and skill sets. There are occasionally times where we will encounter a specific scenario, something so costly that if we do it wrong, we will regret it for the rest of our lives, or we'll understand it as a moral failing. And while those things are not common, they're still important to train for. Going back to this subject and staying in the realm of CQB, there are many activities or skills or maneuvers or techniques that you may never really do in life, or the likelihood that you'll encounter them, whether or not you are professionally employed with a firearm or otherwise. But the day that those things may happen is not the day you want to be trying to figure them out. You could pull back the serious or the specificity of the veil and looking at something like how to draw a handgun from concealment. The likelihood that the average citizen, whether they are in a state that requires a concealed carry permit or they are in a constitutional carry situation, the likelihood that they're going to need to draw a pistol and use that on somebody is very, very unlikely. And when I say need, I'm saying morally justified within the circumstances and the situation. While that situation may be very uncommon, if you are not ready for it, if you have not practiced it, that is not a fun day to try to figure out how to do a thing. So when you look at training, you want to start with the fundamentals. You want to start with the things that you can practice regularly: marksmanship, mobility, accuracy, so on and so forth, decision making. But then the more that you get good at the fundamentals, the better that you are going to be capable at treating the more complicated tasks. If the fundamentals are locked in, the more complicated tasks are going to be slightly easier. To expand this even another layer further, if you are becoming more competent, and I've talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect with the ascent of skill development to the plateau of dogma, down the descent of loss of confidence. The goal then is, if you're stuck on the plateau, it may be hard to realize that you're there. But if you're already at the point where you've sort of mastered your dogmatic skill set, that's when you start branching into other things. And they should most likely be smaller things like becoming more accurate or being faster for a hostage rescue type situation, or situations that you might involve in sort of like around vehicles and being able to make the shot or being accurate in those scenarios. Because there is no shortage of evidence of people who were, say, moderately or reasonably skilled in the generals, not talking about the fundamentals, but like general skill set. But because they said, oh, I'll never have to do that, when they were unfortunately faced with a certain scenario, they were not able to follow through. And so when this comes to your own training, yes, you might want to take it with a grain of salt when you read something on the internet or hear somebody say, oh, you don't need to do that. Maybe the warning is that you're giving too much attention to something that you're less likely to encounter. But if that is not the case, then go forth and train. Go learn how to do the things that are less common so that in the scenario, if you are faced with it, you can, with confidence, solve the problem. See, we spend so much time arguing over how we should train, what we should train, how we should do it, and very little time actually in the field of practice. It's almost like the inverse of the philosopher's problem, where we spend so much time theorizing while not functioning in the philosophical realm, and then find ourselves awkwardly incapable of doing the things that we should have been so more practical about. The gun culture and this sphere does have its own addictions to bravado and its own, well, you don't need to do that because I said so, and so long and so forth. But ultimately, we are responsible for our own actions. It doesn't mean that we walk around dismissing everybody else. That does nobody any good. And so we pursue things, we are oftentimes, or we could be, perhaps if we were less focused on the criticisms of other people, if we were more focused on developing the things that we knew we were weaker at. If you need to spend more time with becoming proficient with a handgun, there's a place to start, or a pistol or a revolver or whatever it is that you have. But don't let it be said, and don't let it control you thinking that you don't need to do something. Rather, lay out your priorities, and once the fundamentals are established, start building off skill sets that may not be common, but if you are ever faced with that scenario and you, in its own phrase, fail it, the consequences are grave, then start addressing those without losing sight of the goal overall. Training is a good thing that we have access to these days. That might be me making an evaluative declaration about it. But if you are so concerned about whether or not you're going to earn the approval or be pulled this way and that by whatever the trends are in social media, then you might be missing the point. Now, ultimately, I believe more of us are on the right path than the internet gives advertisement to, but I thought it would be worth a short episode on how we think about training. So, if you're concerned about whether or not you should train for something, ask yourself, do you have the fundamentals developed so that you can do that? If the answer is yes, give it a shot. Even if it is a couple of sessions or a couple of drills that you practice from time to time that pull the edge away from these very rare but highly consequential scenarios, well, that might be just the thing you need for the time that arises. And let no other man convince you that your need is insufficient. The Redacted Culturecast is an odd publication. It's an odd episode. This is, again, one of those warm-up ones where I've been away for a little while, and I appreciate the time that you've given me. So if you want to support the show, you can head over to the Redacted Culturecast or redactedculture.locals.com, or if you want to check out our shop and upcoming events, as we've got a public land cleanup in Tucson, Arizona coming up in November, you can go to redactedllc.com. Ultimately, the mission of this podcast is to add the intellectual tools behind the ideas that we believe in privacy and property. And if it has been beneficial to you, I thank you for your time. So if you know any other criticisms that come into training that you think are a little shallow, leave them in the comments or reach out to us through Instagram. And as we say, go forth and conquer.